The Battle of Bull Run began on Matthews Hill, over my right shoulder, where an understrength Confederate brigade guarded the Army's left flank. The Union Army committed 15,000 men to an early morning attack on this hill, but the stubborn Confederate resistance slowed them down for more than 2 hours. Eventually, however, the Confederates began to pull back off of Matthews Hill towards Henry Hill. 2 Confederate brigades rushed into the valley to try to stem the Union tide and cover the retreat, and the valley became a chaos with thousands of men firing muskets at close range. The Confederate line bent backwards under the Union assault to be anchored in the tree line over my shoulder. In that tree line was a brigade of soldiers under the command of the young and eccentric Thomas Jackson, an artillery instructor from VMI. His cannons pummeled the Union soldiers as they reformed to meet the new line. The fighting in the valley had thrown the Federals into confusion. It took more than 2 hours for units to be reassembled and for orders to transmit to launch an attack on Henry Hill. Confederate officers used that time to skillfully reinforce their lines and to set up a sharpshooter nest in the home of the widow Judith Henry. As the Union cannons took position, the sharpshooters in the Henry house took aim. The shots whistling among his crewmen prompted Union artillery officer James Ricketts to open fire on the Henry house, killing the widow as she took shelter in the yard. They wheeled artillery up the hill and initiated a close-range artillery duel that prompted some Confederate infantrymen to surge forward and try to capture the Union guns. The guns changed hands many times as the melee swept back and forth across the field. The Union soldiers could see dust rising from the south. More Confederate reinforcements were approaching the scene. First, a cavalry charge led by the young Jeb Stuart crashed into the Union right flank just beyond the Henry house and sent tremors through the Union line. And then the arrival of 2 Confederate brigades threw the Union line into the ultimate panic that would prompt their retreat back towards Matthews Hill. The day began with great promise for the Union Army with the capture of Matthews Hill. But as they tried to press the advantage and capture Henry Hill, they suffered reversals and eventually a retreat that would force them to abandon all gains. Under Confederate pressure, the retreat became a rout, and the day became a disaster for the North.
I'm Doug Ullman with the Civil War Trust. I'm sitting here on Henry Hill at Manassas National Battlefield Park. I'm joined by Jim Burgess, Museum Specialist at Manassas National Battlefield Park, and also by Gary Edelman and Sam Smith of the Civil War Trust staff. Guys, thanks for being here today.
Thanks. My pleasure.
There's a lot of confusion that surrounds this battle, so why does McDowell's force fail to really achieve its objectives?
Well, McDowell's force does have a few big successes. The arrival of Tyler's division to pinch off Matthews Hill probably being the main one. They also have failures such as, Keyes not being able to get his attack off even though he's sitting right behind the Confederate lines here. These people are very confused and the battle is much larger than any of them anticipated.
Another thing I'd like to point out is, many of the regimental officers, at the lower echelon levels, the lieutenants, the captains, even the colonels, many were just politicians in uniform who could barely march their men in a straight line on the parade ground, let alone on the battlefield under fire. The regimental commanders were not up to the task.
So there's a lot of political pressure on Lincoln and the Union Army to sort of bring this war to a head. Gary,
Yes.
How does that sort of factor into the strategic plan here for the Federals?
You have troops who signed up for 90 days, and those 90 days are coming up, so they have to fight pretty soon. Nobody's been trained in anything resembling brigade or division level combat. There's nobody alive in the country, really, or at least in these armies fighting here, that has commanded more than a couple of hundred men at a time in battle.
As soon as they received the first volley, many retreated back to find cover and concealment as quickly as possible. Many of these regiments just scattered in every single direction imaginable, making it almost impossible for their inexperienced officers to rally them again. So other fresh units had to be fed into the fighting here on top of this hill, and more often than not, they were thrown up into the fighting here as they arrived on the field in a rather piecemeal fashion.
Yeah, so let's go to that. Why did the Confederates win this battle?
What I guess I would lead with is that as the day goes on, the Confederates have a strong position up here on Henry Hill. They've got a show of artillery force, and the Union is doing the attacking. A lot of the attacking usually favors the defender, and the Union is attacking one regiment at a time. And as they are wasting their strength, up comes, from Joseph E. Johnston, all these Confederate reinforcements. So as the Union is weakening, the Southerners are getting stronger, right when the Union Army couldn't afford it.
In short, they had enough troops at the right place at the right time.
Yes, Jim could have said it much better than that.
Okay, so the one thing we haven't really talked about, we've sort of hinted at it, is the dazzling array of uniforms that were worn here. You have men from both North and South who are wearing not only blue and gray on both sides, but we have men wearing red, and all, you know, Highlanders wearing their plaid uniforms. I mean, why is there this proliferation of so many vast styles of uniforms, Sam?
Oh, well, you know, at the time the war breaks out, the regular army is minuscule, 16,000 soldiers. Lincoln calls for 75,000 state volunteers. But there's no army structure in place to take all these people in, to adequately supply them with food or with uniforms or with weaponry. You also see a dazzling array of different small arms being used on this field. They very quickly realize, based on events that happen here, that they need to work out the uniform situation if they want to know who's coming towards them. They're going to have the same troubles out west at Wilson's Creek, as a matter of fact.
We can't have any conversation that doesn't bring us out west, can we?
No Western theater today, says Doug. Well, we will overlook the Bull Run of the West for now, but suffice it to say that there were many times in these early battles when the uniform confusion actually made a significant tactical difference. It led to reversals, mostly for the Union side, actually, mistaking Confederates to be friends.
Yeah, indeed. To add to what you've said, you know, of course, in the antebellum period, you know, the militia units, North and South, traditionally wore gray uniforms, and many of these same militia units, you know, came to the battle dressed as they were originally uniformed. So you had just as many Union regiments wearing gray uniforms as there were Southerners wearing gray. But then some of the companies that had only recently been mustered into their regiments had not yet been issued uniforms, so they were still running around in their civilian clothes.
I mean, you could have a blue or a gray uniform, but if it gets covered up with dust, it's all going to be the same color anyway.
Yeah, it was a very sultry Sunday afternoon. There wasn't hardly a whisper of wind, and much of the smoke from the musketry and artillery fire just lingered on the field. You could barely see from one side of this field to the other. And there were times you couldn't even see 100 yards in front of you, owing to this very dense white sulfurous smoke.
Well, we now know a lot about this battlefield. I mean, Jim, how long have you been working here at Manassas?
33 years.
So you've been studying this battle for 33 years.
And I still don't know it.
And you still, but do you think now, knowing all that you know, that you could have won that battle if you were Irwin McDowell?
No one had commanded an army this large before. The logistics were mind-boggling, and you know, under the circumstances, I don't think I could have won on the Union side either.
So do you think, Sam, having worked with Gary, do you think that Gary could have won this battle if he were Irwin McDowell?
Gary, no, I don't think he would have won the battle.
Well, then I wouldn't think you would have won the battle either.
The reason I think you wouldn't have won the battle is because as these attacks are coming up against Henry House Hill, they're facing heavy artillery fire, you know, local Confederate counterattacks. We know now that Jackson planned to stand here like a stone wall. McDowell did not know that in those 2 hours. We can't expect McDowell to have been able to say, no, I'm only facing Jackson and some reinforcements up here, and they plan to hold so I can get around them. I think you would have been confused, like McDowell was, by the nature of the fighting on Henry Hill.
You know, I actually was with a ranger one time on a battlefield, and he said, I think very wisely, that I give tours under the assumption that on my best day, I couldn't have done as well as any of these generals would have done on their worst. And I think that's pretty good advice, actually. People who have been under fire or commanded a company or even a regiment or something like that in today's army would probably tell you something similar.
So the Union forces just completely confused, demoralized, and running as fast as they can back for Washington, right? Why couldn't the rebels have captured Washington City on July 21st?
It's difficult for us to envision the carnage on this field after the battle, and it had a shocking effect upon the participants. General Jackson volunteered to lead the pursuit into Washington if he could get 600 fresh troops. But of course, it wasn't part of Southern strategy at this point in time to be on the offensive and capture Washington. At this point in time, the South only wanted to go their separate way and fight a defensive war. They really did not have the resources to wage an offensive campaign.
I would also push against the idea too that the Union retreat was an all-out pell-mell retreat, that is, until they reached Cub Run later. I mean, the Union was making stands in Centerville where they have even more troops and some fortifications and things like that. So,
it wasn't a complete rout, and many units left the field in good order, probably more said they did than there actually were. But in any case, the U.S. regulars under Sykes certainly covered the retreat pretty well. Of course, Stuart's pursuit of the Union Army towards Sudley Church ended more or less at Sudley Church after he had rounded up so many prisoners. He just did not have enough men to carry on his pursuit.
Sam, can you just sum up this battle in 30 seconds? Go.
The Union has a great morning, but as the afternoon goes on, they've captured one hill, they try to capture a second hill, and that's a hill too far. And the retreat from that hill turns disastrous, and it really shapes the mood of the nation and the spirits of both sides relative to each other as the war goes forward.
Gary.
The Union and the Confederacy both impatient to try to bring this whole war, this conflict to a head, march out from Washington, and they meet each other along the banks of Bull Run. The Confederates had fortified well, but the Union gets around those areas, makes some initial gains, whereas the Confederates kept getting stronger throughout the day by bringing troops to this area by rail, where they're eventually able to envelop the Union forces, push them back, and force them into a route back to Washington, D.C.
Jim?
The Union Army that marched out here was the largest army that had ever been assembled in this country up to that point in time. This would end up being the largest battle ever fought on this continent up to that point in time. After all the dust had settled, some 1,500 Union troops were killed or wounded. Some 1,900 Confederates were killed and wounded. No American army had ever suffered losses of this magnitude before. Neither side had really anticipated such a bloodbath, and neither side was really prepared to care for so many casualties. The dead and wounded littered these fields for days afterwards. No longer would there be any illusions of a short war.
Okay, so the Battle of Bull Run, a day of firsts, followed by a fight for a hill too far that ends in a rout and changes the country's perception of what war is really going to be about. All right, thank you guys for being here, and thank you for watching.